My husband came back from his trip with his lover and her family, expecting to unlock the front door and walk them into the life he had been quietly replacing me with. He expected the house to still be there, the lights on, the story intact. He expected a warm welcome, or at least silence that could be managed later. What he didn't expect was an empty driveway, unfamiliar locks, and the slow realization that the house he planned to showcase no longer belonged to him. I wasn't inside waiting. I wasn't hiding nearby. By the time he arrived, the decision had already been executed, documented, and finalized. The house was gone, not in a metaphorical sense, but in the only way that matters: sold, transferred, finished. He brought them home to prove something, to show them where he came from, or maybe where he thought he was going next. I never asked which. All I knew was that when he stepped out of the car with her, standing too close and her family smiling like guests invited to stay, there was nothing left for him to claim. No living room to gesture toward, no kitchen to explain away, no version of me to dismiss later. Just the quiet consequence of timing he hadn't thought to question. I didn't need to see his face to know what happened next. I knew the order of confusion, irritation, disbelief. I knew the moment embarrassment would arrive, sharp and public. I knew because I had lived under his certainty for years. And I knew that certainty collapses quickly when the ground underneath it is removed. I wasn't at the house when he returned. That part was intentional. I was sitting in a small borrowed space that already felt more like mine than that house ever had. My phone face down on the table. Notifications silenced. I didn't need updates. I had already been informed earlier that morning that everything had gone through as planned. Documents processed, access transferred, ownership changed, clean and irreversible. Whatever reaction unfolded after that belonged to him, not me. There was a strange calm in knowing the moment had passed without me. For years I had been present for every important decision while never truly being part of them. This time, my absence was the point. Power didn't need witnesses. It needed execution. I imagined the way he would stand there, keys in hand, trying again even after the first failure. The way he would laugh it off at first, pretending it was a technical issue. The way his voice would change when someone else noticed. I imagined her family shifting uncomfortably, the smiles tightening, the questions starting. I imagined him checking his phone, then calling mine, assuming there was still room for explanation. There wasn't. What struck me most even then wasn't anger. It was clarity. This wasn't the end of a marriage that morning. It was the end of an assumption. The assumption that I would wait. The assumption that I would absorb shock quietly. The assumption that the house, the marriage, and my role within both were fixed elements he could rearrange without consequence. I had learned over time that people mistake silence for compliance. They mistake patience for permission. I had been quiet for a long time, but not because I didn't see what was happening. I was quiet because I was paying attention. The house had been the centerpiece of our shared life, at least on the surface. It was where decisions were announced after they had already been made, where dinners were hosted to reinforce narratives that benefited him, where I smiled through conversations that subtly erased me. It looked like stability. It functioned like leverage. And until I understood that, I had mistaken endurance for strength. I didn't sell the house because I wanted revenge. I sold it because it was the one move that couldn't be rewritten later. Words could be debated. Intentions could be denied. But ownership is absolute. Once it changes, so does everything else. That morning, before his flight landed, I walked through the house one last time. Not to mourn it, but to see it clearly. Without the context of us, it was just a structure filled with decisions I hadn't made, and space I had learned to shrink inside. I locked the door behind me without hesitation. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt overdue. By the time he arrived with them, the story he planned to tell had already expired. There would be no graceful introduction, no controlled transition, no version of events he could manage in private later. The truth would surface where he least expected it, in front of people he hadn't prepared. To understand how the house disappeared without a single warning, you have to understand the life I was expected to be grateful for. You have to understand how quietly control can change hands, and how easily a woman can be trained to disappear while still standing in the center of the room. Years earlier, long before the house disappeared, I believed I was stepping into a life that made sense. Not perfect, but balanced. I had my own career then, running operations for a regional nonprofit that focused on community outreach and education. The work was demanding, often underfunded, but it mattered to me. I liked knowing where my time went. I liked earning my own money. I liked feeling useful in a way that couldn't be measured by appearances. Daniel admired that about me at first, or at least he said he did. He told people he loved that I was driven, that I cared about something bigger than myself. When we were dating, he listened carefully, the way men do when they're still trying to be chosen. He asked questions, remembered details, made me feel like my perspective had weight. I mistook that attentiveness for a quality. After we married, the dynamic shifted so gradually I didn't register it as a shift at all. Daniel's career accelerated. Consulting firms noticed him, promoted him, moved him into rooms where decisions happened quickly and quietly. My work stayed steady, meaningful but invisible to his world. Somewhere along the way, we began to mean his schedule, his priorities, his long-term vision. I didn't object. I adjusted. The house came not long after. A custom build in a neighborhood people lowered their voices to mention. It was introduced to me as an achievement, something we had earned through sacrifice and discipline. Daniel spoke about it with pride, using phrases like investment and legacy. I focused on the light in the kitchen, the quiet of the street, the idea that this was where we would grow into whatever came next. Everyone loved the house. Friends complimented it with a mix of admiration and envy. His family spoke about it like proof that Daniel had done everything right. Dinner parties became frequent, carefully planned events, where I managed logistics while conversations flowed around me. People referred to it as our home, but decisions about it were rarely framed as ours. Paint colors, layout changes, long-term plans were discussed after the fact, presented as conclusions rather than questions. At first, I told myself this was normal. Daniel was good at this kind of thing. He enjoyed making decisions. I didn't want to compete for control over things that seemed superficial. Whenever I hesitated, gratitude appeared like a corrective measure. Look at what we have. Look at how far we've come. So many people would kill for this life. That sentence became a refrain. It surfaced whenever I asked for clarity about finances, or timelines, or why certain conversations seemed to happen without me. It was never said cruelly. It didn't need to be. Gratitude has a way of quieting doubt more effectively than anger ever could. His family reinforced it without realizing, or perhaps without caring. They were polite, involved, invested in appearances. They spoke in terms of what was best for the family, what made sense long-term, what reflected well. I was included socially, but not structurally. Decisions were summarized for me. Advice was given generously, always framed as concern. I nodded, smiled, absorbed. There were moments, small ones, when something inside me hesitated. A document I was told didn't require my review, a conversation that stopped when I entered the room, a financial update delivered with confidence but no details. None of it seemed alarming on its own. It was the pattern that mattered, and patterns are easy to dismiss when you don't yet have language for them. The house amplified everything. It was large enough to host, impressive enough to impress, and quietly effective at keeping me busy. There was always something to manage, something to prepare, something to maintain. I became very good at making it all look effortless. People praised me for it. Daniel relied on it. And slowly, without any explicit agreement, my role narrowed. I remember one evening in particular, standing in the kitchen after everyone had left. The counters spotless, the lights dimmed just right. Daniel was already on his phone, replying to messages that felt more urgent than the quiet I was standing in. I realized then that I couldn't remember the last time we had discussed a decision before it was made, not argued, not debated, simply discussed. The thought unsettled me more than it should have. I considered saying something that night, asking directly where I fit into the future he spoke about so confidently, But the words felt heavy, accusatory. I didn't want to sound insecure. I didn't want to disrupt the image of stability we had worked so hard to project. So I stayed quiet. Again. Silence became a habit disguised as maturity. I told myself I was being supportive, that relationships required compromise, that not every imbalance was intentional. I trusted the history we shared more than the discomfort I felt. I believed honesty would naturally correct whatever was drifting off course. What I didn't understand then was that I was being trained. Not through cruelty or commands, but through reassurance and omission. I was learning which questions were welcome and which were inconvenient. I was learning to step aside gracefully. I was learning how to occupy space without owning it. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. We had the house, the invitations, the admiration. Inside, something essential was eroding quietly, without drama. I was still standing at the center of my life, but I was no longer shaping it. At the time, I thought this was simply what marriage looked like once the excitement settled. I believed we would correct course naturally. I believed my voice would matter again when the right moment came. I didn't yet understand that the first cracks don't announce themselves loudly. They arrive politely, disguised as care, and they widen only when you stop insisting on being heard. Nothing dramatic happened at first. There was no argument, no betrayal I could point to, no single moment where I could say, "This is where it changed." It was subtler than that. A shift in atmosphere, a quiet rearranging of priorities that I felt before I understood. I would wake up some mornings with a faint sense of being slightly out of place, as if the life I was standing in had moved a few inches to the left while I slept. Daniel was still kind, still attentive in public, still efficient in the way that impressed people. But at home something had thinned. Conversations became shorter, more purposeful. We talked about logistics instead of ideas, schedules instead of feelings. When I spoke, he listened just long enough to respond, not long enough to engage. It wasn't dismissive, it was efficient. And somehow that made it harder to question. His work hours stretched without explanation. Not late nights exactly, but longer days that ended with him checking emails at the dinner table, his phone face down when I walked past. He traveled more often, trips that appeared suddenly on the calendar and were framed as unavoidable. I adjusted my plans around his without thinking twice. It felt natural, almost responsible to be flexible. What changed most was not his presence, but his availability. He was physically there, yet distant, his attention always half elsewhere. When I asked about his day, the answers were brief and polished, as if he had already told the story once and didn't need to repeat it. When I asked follow-up questions, he smiled and said I didn't need to worry about the details. He had it handled. That phrase appeared often. "I've got it handled." It sounded reassuring. It also ended conversations. The imbalance didn't announce itself as control. It crept in as convenience. Financial updates became summaries instead of discussions. Decisions about timing, commitments, even social plans were presented as conclusions. He never said I wasn't involved. He simply moved fast enough that involvement felt unnecessary. I noticed how often I hesitated before speaking. Not because I feared his reaction, but because I didn't want to slow things down. He seemed so certain, so focused. Interrupting that certainty felt selfish. I began to edit myself mid-thought, choosing questions that wouldn't derail momentum. I told myself this was partnership, that compromise was part of maturity. There were moments when I sensed another influence, though I couldn't name it yet. Plans we had discussed casually were postponed without explanation. Commitments I cared about were suddenly inconvenient. When I asked why, the answers were vague. Things have shifted. Priorities change. We'll revisit it later. Later became another word that ended conversations. Once I mentioned a weekend we had talked about spending together. He frowned slightly, as if searching for the memory. "I thought we decided against that," he said. I hadn't. But I let it go. Memory is a strange thing, especially when you begin to doubt your own. Our social circle reinforced the illusion of stability. People admired our life openly. They praised our balance, our house, our dynamic. "You're so lucky," they told me. "Daniel's doing so well. You must be proud." Their certainty made my uncertainty feel unreasonable. I smiled, agreed, absorbed the praise like proof that nothing was wrong. When discomfort has no audience, it starts to feel imaginary. I remember one afternoon standing in the kitchen, scrolling through our shared calendar, noticing how many events appeared without my input. Meetings, trips, dinners I hadn't known about until they were already set. It wasn't that he hid them. He simply didn't announce them. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, trying to decide whether this warranted a conversation. It felt too small to justify confrontation, too significant to ignore. That was the pattern. Everything lived in that space between small and significant. I almost spoke up one evening after he canceled plans we had made weeks earlier. I asked why, keeping my tone light. He laughed and said something had come up, that it wasn't a big deal. "Don't overthink it," he added gently. "You know how my schedule is." The words weren't cruel. The implication was clear. My reaction was unnecessary. I apologized without realizing I had done it. That night, lying awake beside him, I wondered when I had started needing permission to feel unsettled. I wondered when peace had begun to depend on my silence. The questions felt dangerous, so I pushed them aside. Tomorrow would be better. This was just a phase. All marriages had them. Near the end of that season, I noticed something small and oddly persistent. A repeated destination on his calendar. A city that appeared more often than before, always for short trips, always framed as routine. It didn't alarm me, it simply lodged itself in my awareness, like a word you hear often enough that it starts to sound unfamiliar. I didn't investigate, I didn't ask follow-up questions. I filed it away without knowing why. At the time, I still believed honesty would be enough, that if something was wrong, it would surface naturally, corrected by trust and time. I didn't yet understand that some shifts aren't accidents, they are rehearsals, and that the first cracks are easiest to miss when you're standing inside them, convincing yourself the structure is still sound. I noticed the name before I noticed the feeling. It appeared once casually, the way unimportant things are introduced so they don't invite questions. Daniel mentioned it in passing while scanning his phone, his tone neutral, almost bored. Cassandra. He said it the way you say a street name you pass every day without thinking about it. I registered it, nodded, and kept listening for whatever he was about to say next. Nothing followed. At first I assumed it was work. There were always new people, new projects, new layers I didn't fully see anymore. The name didn't bother me until I realized how carefully it was being handled. It surfaced just enough to exist, but never enough to be explained. That space around it felt deliberate. A few days later I asked about it. Not directly. I framed it as curiosity, a neutral question that didn't carry suspicion. "Who's Cassandra?" Daniel didn't pause, not long enough for most people to notice. But I noticed. His answer came quickly, smoothly, as if it had already been prepared. A colleague, someone involved in a project. Nothing I needed to worry about. The words were reassuring, the tone was defensive. That was when I understood this wasn't about who she was. It was about why he didn't want me asking. After that, Cassandra became an invisible presence. Not someone I saw, but someone I felt shaping the space around me. Plans shifted more abruptly. Decisions were justified as advice he'd received elsewhere. Conversations ended with references to perspectives I wasn't privy to. He didn't say her name again, but I didn't need him to. The absence spoke louder than repetition. What unsettled me most was how easily she seemed to fit into the structure that had been pushing me out. Whatever influence she had, it aligned perfectly with the life Daniel was building without consulting me. Long-term plans I had once been part of were quietly postponed. Commitments I cared about were reframed as inconvenient. When I objected gently, he reminded me how temporary everything was. Just a busy period, just a transition. There was nothing dramatic to react to, No late-night calls, no lipstick on a collar, no obvious lie. Just a growing sense that I was no longer the primary audience for his decisions. The family angle surfaced next, though I didn't recognize it immediately. Daniel mentioned expectations in a vague way, using words like they and everyone without specifying who he meant. He spoke about background, about fit, about how certain things needed to be handled carefully. It sounded less like work and more like social choreography. I listened closely, trying to understand where I stood in a conversation that seemed to include people I hadn't met. One afternoon, scrolling absent-mindedly through social media, I paused on a photo someone had shared from a professional event. Daniel wasn't in it, but I recognized the setting. My eyes moved instinctively through the faces, and for a moment I felt something familiar and wrong at the same time. A woman near the center of the frame, confident, composed, smiling like she belonged there. I didn't know why she stood out. I only knew she did. I didn't save the photo. I didn't look her up. I told myself I was imagining patterns where none existed. The rational part of me insisted I was still married to a man who came home every night, who hadn't given me a reason to doubt him. And yet, something had shifted from possibility to probability in my mind. I tried once to voice my discomfort to someone else. A friend I trusted, someone who knew me well enough to hear what I wasn't saying. I framed it carefully, describing changes without assigning blame. She listened, nodded, and smiled sympathetically. "You're probably overthinking it," she said. "He's under a lot of pressure. These things happen." I didn't argue. I thanked her for listening and changed the subject. On the drive home, I felt smaller than I had before the conversation. Not because she dismissed me, but because her reaction mirrored my own doubts. When no one else sees what you see, you start to question your vision. The first clear lie arrived quietly. It was small enough that he didn't bother covering it carefully. A timeline that didn't match. A location that contradicted something he had already told me. When I realized it, I felt a strange sense of relief. Not because I wanted to be right, but because uncertainty had finally resolved into fact. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask for clarification. I stored the information the way you store something fragile, setting it aside until you know what to do with it. Awareness settled in my chest, steady and unmistakable. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was management. From that point on, I stopped trying to close the distance between us. I observed instead. I noticed how often my presence was treated as optional, how easily my absence was accommodated. I saw the shape of a future forming that did not include me, and I understood that it wasn't being built in secret. It was being built in plain sight, relying on my silence. The house, the marriage, my role within both began to feel connected in a way I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. I wasn't just being edged out emotionally. I was being repositioned structurally. By the time I went to bed that night, Cassandra was no longer an abstract name. She was a signal, and signals, once recognized, are impossible to ignore. I stopped thinking of the house as a home the day I realized it functioned perfectly without me. Not physically, of course. I was still there, arranging flowers, coordinating repairs, hosting dinners. But structurally, it didn't need my voice. Decisions moved through it without ever passing through me, and once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. The house had become a symbol long before it became a weapon. It represented success to everyone who stepped inside. Proof that Daniel had built something solid, enviable, permanent. His colleagues admired it. His family spoke about it with pride, as if its existence validated their own choices. When people praised the life we had, they gestured toward the walls, the view, the address, rarely toward me. I played my role well. I knew how to make guests feel welcome, how to manage schedules, how to maintain the illusion of effortlessness. I was praised for it constantly. "You keep everything running so smoothly," people said. "Daniel couldn't do this without you." The irony was that he already was. The first time I noticed something was truly wrong wasn't during an argument or a confession. It was during a conversation I wasn't part of. Daniel was on the phone in the study, the door half closed. I passed by without meaning to listen, but my name caught my attention. Not spoken directly, but referenced, as if I were an obstacle to be managed rather than a person to be consulted. Later that evening I asked about it, casually. Daniel smiled and waved it off. "Just logistics," he said. "Things you don't need to worry about." The words landed with unexpected weight. I had been worrying for months, quietly, carefully. Being told I didn't need to felt less like reassurance and more like instruction. It wasn't long after that I came across paperwork that hadn't been meant for me. Not hidden exactly, just assumed I wouldn't look closely. Documents related to the house, to planning, to contingencies. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. Just clear evidence that decisions were being structured around my absence. My signature wasn't required for understanding, only for consent. That was the moment exclusion stopped feeling accidental. His family's involvement became clearer after that. Conversations that once felt like background noise sharpened into focus. Comments about legacy, about how things should be handled in the future. Suggestions framed as advice that carried the weight of expectation. I realized they weren't speaking hypothetically. They were speaking ahead of me. One evening, during a small gathering, someone made an offhand remark about how adaptable I was, how understanding, how easy I made things. It was meant as a compliment. It felt like a diagnosis. I smiled, thanked them, and excused myself to the kitchen, where I stood gripping the counter until the feeling passed. I began to understand that the house wasn't just where we lived. It was leverage. It was the stage on which Daniel's narrative played out. And I was a prop that could be replaced as long as the structure remained intact. The connection to Cassandra emerged quietly, the way most truths do when they've been hiding in plain sight. A comment about how someone else would appreciate the space. A remark about how flexible the future could be once certain things were settled. He never said her name in those moments, but I heard it anyway. It echoed in the spaces he assumed I wouldn't notice. I didn't react. I didn't confront him. I shifted inward instead, collecting information the way you collect tools. Carefully, without urgency. I stopped asking questions that invited reassurance. I stopped seeking explanations that could be manipulated. I watched. The house changed in my eyes after that. Rooms I had once filled with intention felt neutral, temporary. I noticed how easily it could be emptied, how nothing about it required me specifically. It wasn't that I felt rejected, I felt repositioned. And once I accepted that, fear gave way to clarity. There was a moment, standing alone in the living room after everyone had left one night, when I understood exactly what was happening. The house had been used to anchor me, to keep me busy, to give me a sense of belonging while my authority quietly dissolved. It had worked because I wanted it to work. I had mistaken stability for safety. From that point on, I stopped thinking about whether I was overreacting. I stopped wondering if things would correct themselves. I accepted the reality in front of me. This wasn't about love fading or communication breaking down. This was about control being consolidated elsewhere. And if the house was the centerpiece of that control, then it was also the point of vulnerability. I didn't yet know how or when I would act. I only knew that silence would no longer be accidental. It would be strategic. The house had never been my refuge. It had been my leverage, waiting for me to recognize it. Once I did, everything else began to fall into place. Daniel told me about the trip the way he told me everything else by then, as if it were already settled. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, phone in hand, scanning messages while speaking, his voice calm and certain. It was a necessary trip, he said, important meetings, a chance to solidify relationships. He would be gone longer than usual, but it was unavoidable. I listened without interrupting. I nodded at the right moments. Nothing in his tone invited discussion, and I didn't try to force one. What surprised me was not the announcement itself, but the way my body reacted to it. There was no anxiety, no spike of fear. Just a sharp, quiet awareness that this trip mattered more than the others. The details didn't add up, not in an obvious way, but in the gaps between what he said. The dates were vague. The location shifted slightly, depending on how he framed it. When I asked about his schedule, he smiled and said it was still in flux. Lots of moving parts. You know how it is. I did know how it was. That was the problem. In the days leading up to his departure, Daniel moved through the house differently. He tied up loose ends with an urgency I hadn't seen before, closing accounts, delegating tasks, making sure everything ran smoothly without him. It felt less like preparation for absence and more like rehearsal, as if he were practicing what it would be like not to return to the same life. There was a moment that made it unmistakable. We were discussing something small, a delivery that needed to be scheduled while he was away. He waved it off and said it could wait, that I wouldn't need to worry about it. The phrasing was casual, but the implication was not. He was planning for a version of events where my involvement didn't matter. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask what that meant. I filed it away with the other confirmations I had learned to recognize. This wasn't just absence, it was replacement. Confirmation arrived without effort soon after. A conversation I overheard by accident. A calendar entry that synced incorrectly. A reference to accommodations that didn't align with business travel. I didn't need to dig. I didn't need proof stacked neatly in front of me. I learned enough to understand the shape of the truth. This trip wasn't about work. It was about transition. What changed everything was realizing he wasn't going alone. The evidence was subtle, but unmistakable once seen. Multiple bookings, coordinated timing, mentions of preferences that weren't his, and threaded through it all, the unmistakable presence of other people, not colleagues, family. He wasn't just taking Cassandra with him, he was bringing her world into his. That knowledge landed heavily, but it didn't knock the air from my lungs. It clarified something instead. This wasn't secrecy anymore. It was declaration. He wasn't planning to come back and explain. He was planning to come back established, supported by witnesses who would legitimize the version of his life he had already chosen. And still, I said nothing. In fact, I became easier. I asked if he needed anything before he left. I made sure his logistics were handled. I wished him a good trip. I played my role perfectly because by then I understood exactly what he thought my role was. He mistook my silence for acceptance, for resignation, for the kind of quiet that comes before compliance. It never occurred to him that silence could also mean preparation. The night before he left, we sat across from each other at the table, the house unusually quiet. He talked about meetings, about travel fatigue, about how glad he was that I understood how demanding things were right now. I watched him carefully, noting how comfortable he was in his certainty, how little he questioned his position. He believed distance protected him. It didn't. When he left the next morning, suitcase in hand, he kissed my cheek absently and reminded me of the date he'd be back. I nodded, watched him walk out the door, and waited until the sound of his car faded from the street. The house settled into stillness around me, a silence that felt different from before, cleaner, more honest. That was the moment everything changed. I stood in the middle of the living room and looked around, not with nostalgia but with assessment. I saw the house clearly for what it was, a structure that had held me in place while decisions were made elsewhere. A structure that assumed I would remain passive, predictable, present. I made a quiet vow then, not fueled by anger or spite, but by certainty. If he left on this trip, the marriage he returned to would not exist. Not because I would destroy it in a fit of emotion, but because I would no longer participate in a reality that required my erasure. This wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a decision in the dramatic sense. It was a conclusion. The kind that arrives when all other options have been exhausted quietly. As the day passed, I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I didn't replay conversations looking for excuses. I simply moved forward. Distance hadn't given him safety. It had given me space. The moment he left, I stopped waiting. The house felt different the moment Daniel left. Not emptier, exactly, but quieter in a way that sharpened my thoughts instead of dulling them. His absence didn't create chaos. It created space. For the first time in months, nothing in the air felt rushed or managed. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the silence, and realized how long it had been since silence hadn't felt like something to fill. I didn't cry. I didn't collapse onto the bed or replay his goodbye in my head. Whatever grief I might have felt had already been spent in smaller pieces over many months. What remained was focus, a calm, almost clinical clarity that surprised me with its steadiness. I began to look at everything differently, not with suspicion, but with intention. The house, the schedules, the systems we shared, all the things I had once treated as background noise came into sharp relief. I understood now that the truth hadn't been hidden carefully. It had been hidden behind the assumption that I wouldn't look too closely. I started with what was already mine to access: shared calendars, service accounts, household records. Not his private messages, not anything that would require emotional intrusion. I wasn't searching for validation. I was verifying structure. Patterns emerged quickly once I knew how to look. Repeated dates, familiar names appearing across unrelated platforms, plans that extended far beyond the scope of a temporary trip. What I found wasn't shocking, that was the strange part. It felt inevitable, like reading the final chapter of a book whose ending you already understand. There were parallel arrangements in place, overlapping timelines that made sense only if he wasn't planning to maintain a single life. This wasn't impulsive behavior, it was staged. The first piece that truly unsettled me was something that shouldn't have existed at all, a reservation tied to dates he had described as flexible. Details that contradicted the story he had given me without trying very hard to hide it. It wasn't careless, it was confident. He believed he was too far ahead for me to catch up. I didn't feel betrayed in that moment. I felt confirmed. As I moved through the house, I began to see how Cassandra fit into it, even without being physically present. Her name appeared in contexts that suggested permanence rather than convenience. Future considerations. Living arrangements implied, not stated. It became clear that this wasn't about replacing me emotionally. It was about replacing me structurally. That realization changed everything. I had spent months trying to understand what I had done wrong, what I could have handled differently. Standing there with the evidence laid out so plainly, I understood that my behavior had never been the issue. The system had been built to function without me long before I recognized it. I stopped seeing myself as behind. I wasn't scrambling to catch up to a decision already made. I was early to the moment when that decision would matter. And being early meant I still had leverage. That was when my mindset shifted completely. I stopped reacting internally. I started calculating. Not out of malice, but out of necessity. I assessed what I controlled, what I didn't, and what would happen if I acted too soon. There was no urgency to gather everything. In fact, restraint became essential. If I confronted him now, he would adjust. He would hide better. He would control the narrative more tightly. If I moved quietly, he would continue assuming the ground beneath him was solid. So I chose not to take everything. Not yet. I left some things untouched, deliberately. I avoided patterns that would suggest investigation. I kept my routines normal. I answered his occasional messages with the same neutral warmth he expected. Each interaction reinforced his belief that nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. I understood now that silence could be a weapon when used with precision. It kept him comfortable. It kept him predictable. And predictability, I was learning, was far more valuable than confrontation. There was a moment late one night when I sat alone at the dining table, documents spread out before me, and felt the weight of what I was about to do. Not fear exactly, responsibility. I knew that once I acted, there would be no way to soften the impact. No conversation that could ease the transition. Whatever came next would be decisive. That knowledge didn't stop me, it steadied me. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like someone who had finally understood the rules of a game she hadn't realized she was playing. And once you understand the rules, you stop asking for fairness. You start planning outcomes. By the end of that week, I knew enough. Not everything, but enough. enough to act without guessing, enough to move forward without hesitation, enough to ensure that when the moment came it wouldn't be mine to survive, but his to face. Knowledge didn't make me angry, it made me precise. And precision, I was learning, was far more dangerous than rage. I stopped hoping for a version of events where he came back changed sometime during the second week of his trip. Not because I discovered something new, but because hope no longer made sense. It required me to believe that my absence from his plans was accidental, that everything I had seen could still be explained away by timing or stress. Once that belief collapsed, hope felt less like optimism and more like self-betrayal. The question shifted quietly but completely. It was no longer what he was doing or who he was doing it with. It became what I was willing to tolerate, and for how long. That was the moment clarity replaced denial. I thought about revenge, briefly, the way anyone does when they realize they've been systematically replaced. I imagined confrontation, exposure, the satisfaction of watching him scramble. The images came easily, fueled by months of swallowed doubt. But just as quickly, they lost their appeal. Revenge would still center him. It would still require my energy, my voice, my explanation. I didn't want to hurt him. I wanted to be free of him. There is a difference between revenge and agency. Revenge seeks pain as proof. Agency seeks removal. Once I understood that distinction, the path forward narrowed with startling precision. I began evaluating my options the way I had learned to evaluate everything else. Practically, legally, emotionally. Walking away quietly would preserve his control over the narrative and the assets that supported it. Confrontation would alert him too soon and allow him to adjust. Counseling, negotiation, even separation on his terms would keep me reactive, always responding to decisions he initiated. There was only one move that changed the balance immediately and permanently. The house. It wasn't sentimental to him in the way people imagine. It was strategic. It anchored his image, his authority, his sense of permanence. It was the backdrop against which he planned to introduce a new life, complete with witnesses who would legitimize it. As long as the house remained intact, so did his assumption that the structure of his life was unmovable. Timing mattered. He was away. His attention was divided. His confidence was high. He believed everything important was already settled. Waiting longer would only give him more room to solidify arrangements I wasn't part of. Acting now meant protecting myself before the ground shifted completely. I didn't make the decision in a dramatic rush. I made it in stages, checking each internal reaction carefully. Fear surfaced, as it always does when permanence enters the conversation. Fear of judgment, fear of legal consequences, fear of being labeled irrational, vindictive, unstable. Those labels had power because I had spent years avoiding them. Then I recognized something else. Silence hadn't protected me from being erased. Reasonableness hadn't preserved my position. The cost of being misunderstood was already paid. Fear, once acknowledged, became information rather than an obstacle. I decided not to announce anything. No ultimatums, no warnings, no emotional speeches designed to soften what was coming. I understood now that announcements are invitations to interfere. Silence, used correctly, is not passive. It is protective. Outwardly, nothing about my behavior changed. I responded to his messages with the same neutral warmth he expected. I asked if he was getting enough rest. I wished him luck with his meetings. I appeared supportive, engaged, unchanged. Each exchange reinforced his belief that the system still favored him. Internally, everything had shifted. I had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Once crossed, hesitation would only weaken the outcome. I thought about the house again, not as a building, but as a symbol of everything I had been asked to accept without question. The dinners I hosted, the decisions summarized for me, the way I had learned to shrink my voice to preserve harmony. Selling it wouldn't erase those years, but it would end their influence over my future. There was a moment late at night when doubt crept in quietly. Not about whether he deserved it, but about whether I could carry the consequences without explanation. I pictured the reactions, the shock, the anger, the way my motives would be misinterpreted. I sat with that discomfort until it lost its edge. I wasn't doing this to be understood. I was doing it to be done. I made a private commitment to myself then. Once I started, I would not hesitate. I would not pause to justify my actions to anyone who hadn't protected my place in the first place. I would accept whatever misunderstandings followed as the cost of choosing myself. The strange thing was how calm I felt after that. The decision didn't energize me or drain me. It settled me. Everything that followed felt like logistics, not emotion. Steps to be taken, calls to be made, processes to initiate. The kind of clarity that comes only after a choice has been fully claimed. I didn't feel cruel. I felt resolved. By the time I went to bed that night, I wasn't thinking about how he would react when he found out. I wasn't imagining his face or her response or the questions that would follow. Those reactions belonged to a future I was no longer managing. Once I decided, everything else became logistics. While they were playing family, I was dismantling the structure that made his confidence possible. The contrast would have been almost absurd if it hadn't been so precise. Somewhere far away, Daniel was moving through curated moments, relaxed enough to believe everything waiting at home would remain exactly where he left it. And here, in the quiet of the house, I was turning intention into action. The first practical step felt deceptively small. A phone call that didn't sound dramatic. A conversation conducted in a professional tone that carried no emotion. Once the process began, it didn't ask me how I felt. It asked me for confirmation, for authorization, for clarity. I gave it all three. The moment paperwork became active, I understood there would be no rehearsal, no undoing. Intention had crossed into execution. I kept my communication with Daniel steady and unremarkable. Short messages, neutral updates, the kind of exchanges that signaled continuity, not disruption. He responded in the same distracted way he always had, confident enough not to look too closely. Each calm response from me bought time. Time was the currency that mattered most. The house began to change without him knowing. Not physically at first, structurally, access permissions updated, documentation reassigned, decisions made in my name without fanfare. I felt a quiet authority settle into place, unfamiliar but grounding. For years, systems had moved around me. Now they moved because of me. There was no rush of triumph, just focus. Midway through the process, a complication surfaced, a question that required clarification, a hesitation from someone unused to speed without spectacle. For a brief moment, the plan felt exposed, like a thread pulled too quickly. I adjusted without panic, recalibrated, and moved forward. The near miss reminded me that timing was everything. One careless explanation could shift the balance. Precision mattered. At night, alone in the house, I allowed myself a moment of doubt. Not about whether I was right, but about permanence. Once done, there would be no softened version of events, no shared narrative to ease the transition. I sat with that truth, letting it settle. Then I remembered the ease with which he had made plans that erased me. The doubt lost its footing. A message from the trip arrived the next morning, a casual update, a photo that suggested ease and belonging. He looked comfortable, confident, already positioned inside the life he believed was unfolding exactly as planned. I studied the image longer than necessary, not out of jealousy, but out of clarity. The closer they felt to home, the further home was moving away. I didn't respond right away. Not to punish him, but to maintain rhythm. When I did reply, it was brief and supportive. Safe travels. Hope you're enjoying the time. The lie wasn't in my words. It was in the assumption that home still existed as he understood it. Each day brought another confirmation, another step completed. The process didn't pause to ask if I was ready. It assumed I was. That assumption felt earned. I moved through the house methodically, choosing what would follow me and what would not. Not everything deserved to cross the threshold into my future. I selected with intention, not nostalgia. There were moments when I caught myself listening for his presence out of habit. The sound of keys, the shift in the air when someone else entered a room. Each time, the silence reminded me that I was no longer waiting. That habit, once broken, didn't return. By the end of the week, the final confirmation was set in motion. Not completed yet, but inevitable. I stood in the kitchen, phone in hand, reading the message twice to make sure I understood. The outcome was now locked. The house would be gone before he had time to anticipate loss. I felt ready then, not for confrontation but for impact. Whatever came next would not require my performance or my explanation. It would simply unfold. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months. No dreams, no rehearsed conversations, just rest, the kind that comes when a decision has been carried fully to the edge. When I woke the next morning, I didn't check my phone immediately. I made coffee. I stood by the window and watched the light move across a space that was already transitioning out of my life. I felt no urge to capture it, to memorialize it. This wasn't an ending I needed to remember in detail. By the time he thought to look back, there was nothing left to see. The morning everything became final arrived without ceremony. No dramatic weather, no sense of countdown. Just a clear day and a quiet house that had already begun to let go of me. Daniel was still away, still assuming time was on his side. I woke early, not from nerves, but from the strange calm that comes when a decision has already done its work. I moved through my routine slowly, deliberately. Coffee, a shower, clothes chosen for practicality rather than symbolism. This wasn't a day for performance. It was a day for completion. By the time I sat at the table with my phone and documents laid out in front of me, I felt steady, grounded in the certainty that nothing I did next was impulsive. The final authorization came through mid-morning. A message, brief and professional, confirming what I already knew was inevitable. Ownership had officially changed. The house was no longer ours. In the most concrete sense possible, it no longer belonged to him. I read the confirmation twice, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to register the weight of it fully. This was permanent. There would be no reversal, no discussion that could soften it. I didn't feel triumph. I felt sober, aware. I understood exactly what I had just removed from his control, and how deeply that control had shaped the last years of my life. The house had been the anchor of his certainty. Without it, the narrative he relied on would fracture quickly. What followed surprised me in its simplicity. Systems responded to me without hesitation. Professionals addressed me directly. Questions were asked, answers given, processes completed. For years, decisions had flowed around me, summarized after the fact. Today, they flowed through me. Not because I demanded it, but because I had claimed it. I began sorting through what would leave with me and what would not. I was careful, methodical. I took what reflected my future, not what represented a past I no longer intended to curate. Personal items, documents, things that carried meaning rather than status. I documented everything, not out of fear, but out of fairness. I wasn't interested in stripping the place bare or leaving chaos behind. I wanted clarity, not punishment. There were moments when memory tugged at me unexpectedly. A mark on the wall where a photo had once hung. A drawer I opened without thinking. I acknowledged those moments without indulging them. Nostalgia is persuasive, but it isn't authoritative. The house had been powerful only as long as I stayed inside the role it required. As rooms emptied, they lost their hold on me. The space looked larger, less personal, almost anonymous. I realized then how little of myself had ever truly been embedded in it. It had been designed to impress, not to hold me. Seeing it that way stripped it of its last illusion. By early afternoon, the final physical steps were complete. Keys gathered, access transferred. I walked through the house one last time, not to say goodbye, but to confirm there was nothing left to do. No loose ends, no unfinished business. The stillness felt neutral, neither heavy nor hollow. At the door I paused briefly, my hand resting on the handle, not out of doubt, but acknowledgement. This was the threshold I had crossed long before today, even if the paperwork had lagged behind my resolve. I locked the door and placed the keys where they needed to be, an ordinary action that carried extraordinary consequence. I didn't send a message. I didn't announce what I had done. Silence wasn't cruelty, it was precision. Any explanation offered now would dilute the impact, invite negotiation, reopen a door I had already closed. There was a moment driving away when I realized I wasn't thinking about Daniel at all. Not about his reaction, not about the confrontation that would inevitably follow. My mind was quiet, focused forward. Whatever storm waited on the other side of his return was no longer mine to manage. Later that afternoon, I received a message from him. Casual, distracted. He mentioned travel delays, asked about something trivial at the house, assumed continuity without question. I read it once and set the phone down without replying. There was nothing left to clarify. As the day moved toward evening, a sense of completion settled in. Not relief, exactly, but alignment. The external world had finally caught up to the decision I had made weeks ago. The house was gone. The structure that had contained me was dismantled. What remained was open space and the responsibility to fill it on my own terms. By the time his plane touched down, the outcome was already sealed. He would step back into a life that no longer existed, searching for something that had been transferred, documented, and released. By the time he landed, the house was already someone else's. I wasn't waiting at the house when Daniel came back. That part mattered. I wasn't hiding and I wasn't fleeing. I was exactly where I intended to be, already outside the life he thought he was returning to. Everything had been finalized before his flight landed. There was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to undo. He didn't come back alone. I learned that from a message I didn't answer, and from the quiet certainty that settled in my chest when I imagined the scene. Cassandra beside him, close enough to signal belonging. Her family trailing behind, guests invited to witness a future he had already rehearsed. This wasn't a mistake or an accident. It was meant to be an arrival, an unveiling. He believed the house would do the talking for him. I wasn't there to hear it. The first sign that something was wrong came quickly. I knew that much from the way his calls began stacking up on my phone. Missed calls in rapid succession, the spacing between them shrinking. Confusion always comes before anger. I let the phone ring, face down on the table, while I continued with my day. I pictured him at the front door, keys in hand, trying again after the first failure. The moment of irritation when he assumed a lock malfunction. The glance over his shoulder, the forced laugh meant to reassure the people behind him. He would have tried the handle again, harder this time, as if insistence could override reality. When the realization began to surface, it wouldn't have been quiet. It would have been public. A neighbor passing by. A comment made without context. A sentence like, "Oh, didn't you know? The house sold last week. That was all it would take. No confrontation, no speech, just a fact introduced at the worst possible moment." The audience mattered. Cassandra's family wasn't prepared for this. They had been invited to witness stability, not collapse. Whatever narrative Daniel had constructed depended on control, on timing, on privacy. Standing on the sidewalk with luggage and questions, he would have none of it. My phone vibrated again. Then again, text messages this time. "Where are you? Why isn't the key working? Did you change the locks? Call me. Now." The tone shifted quickly. From confusion to irritation, from irritation to something sharper. I could almost hear his voice changing, the way it did when things stopped obeying him. I didn't respond. Silence was no longer avoidance. It was alignment. There was a stretch of time when the calls stopped altogether. That was the moment he would have been trying to fix things without me, calling someone else, asking questions he didn't want to ask, pretending authority while it drained out of him in real time. Then the messages resumed, longer now, less controlled. "What is going on? This isn't funny. I have people here. You need to explain this. I waited. I knew exactly when anger would give way to desperation. I had lived inside that progression for years. Control first, then pressure, then appeal. He had always believed escalation would force resolution. It wouldn't this time. When I finally responded, it was with one message: short, factual, emotionless. I told him where his belongings were stored. I told him how long the unit was paid for. I told him that any further communication should go through my attorney. I didn't explain why. I didn't mention Cassandra. I didn't acknowledge the family standing beside him. I didn't need to. That message wasn't closure for him. It was a boundary for me. What followed unfolded without my involvement. I heard about it later, through fragments and second-hand accounts. Cassandra's confusion, her parents' discomfort, the questions that couldn't be answered without exposing the truth he had been managing so carefully. Whatever confidence he had carried onto that flight didn't survive the afternoon. I didn't correct any of the stories that spread after that. I didn't defend myself or clarify timelines. I didn't need to. Truth has a way of stabilizing itself once it's released. The less I said, the clearer everything became. Daniel tried again that evening, a different tone, less anger, more urgency. He said we needed to talk, that there had been misunderstandings, that this didn't have to happen this way. He said my name the way he used to when he wanted something softened. I didn't reply. I wasn't interested in hearing explanations that arrived only after consequences. I wasn't interested in rewriting history to preserve his comfort. Whatever he felt standing outside a house that no longer belonged to him was not something I needed to process with him. That night, I slept peacefully. Not because I was numb, but because I was done. The confrontation he had prepared for never happened. The explanation he assumed he could control was never requested. The house had delivered the message more clearly than words ever could. He came back looking for a home. What he found was the end. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was settled. The house was gone. The confrontation had passed without me raising my voice, and the noise that once filled my life had finally burned itself out. What remained wasn't triumph or grief. It was steadiness, the kind that comes when something false has been fully removed. I didn't lose everything. I lost what had already stopped belonging to me. I lost the marriage as I thought it was, the future I had been adjusting myself to fit, the version of love that required my quiet cooperation to survive. I lost the role of being understanding at my own expense. I lost the habit of waiting for clarity that never came. Those losses hurt, but they were necessary. They cleared space I didn't realize I'd been fighting to breathe in. What I kept mattered more. I kept my agency. I kept my financial independence. I kept the ability to make decisions without asking permission or softening their impact for someone else's comfort. I kept my sense of self intact, something I had been trading away in small, polite pieces for years. When I looked at my life without the house, without Daniel's certainty looming over every choice, I felt lighter, not diminished. Home, I realized, was never the structure he controlled. It wasn't the address people admired or the rooms designed to impress. Home was the place where I wasn't interchangeable, where I didn't have to shrink or wait my turn to matter. Selling the house didn't end my dream of stability. It ended the illusion that stability required my silence. I didn't become harder through this. I became clearer. Clear about what I would no longer tolerate. Clear about how easily love can be confused with endurance. Clear about the difference between compromise and erasure. Strength, I learned, doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it locks a door, hands over the keys, and walks away without explanation. There were days after when doubt tried to return. Moments when I wondered if I should have handled things differently, spoken sooner, made it easier for everyone involved. Those thoughts passed quickly. I reminded myself that ease for others had been the priority for too long. Choosing myself didn't make me cruel. It made me honest. I never met Cassandra's family. I never heard their version of events directly. I didn't need to. Whatever they thought of me was shaped by a story I hadn't written, and I was no longer interested in correcting narratives that didn't serve my life. I wasn't leaving to be understood, I was leaving to be free. Daniel tried a few more times after that. Messages softened by regret, references to history, attempts to reframe what had happened as confusion rather than choice. I responded only when necessary, only through proper channels, only with facts. The woman who once absorbed emotional weight to keep peace no longer existed. In the weeks that followed, I began rebuilding quietly. Not dramatically, not for display. I found a place that fit me rather than impressing others. I made decisions slowly, with intention. For the first time in years, I trusted my instincts without second-guessing them. The confidence that grew from that was deeper than anything the house had ever given me. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you've ever sensed that your life was being rearranged without your consent, I want you to know this. You're not imagining it. Awareness is the first form of power. Silence doesn't have to mean surrender. Sometimes it's preparation. Walking away doesn't always look like a dramatic exit. Sometimes it looks like paperwork signed quietly, boundaries enforced calmly, and a life reclaimed without apology. You don't owe explanations to people who benefited from your absence. This story wasn't about revenge, it was about dignity, about recognizing the moment when staying costs more than leaving. About understanding that endings don't always arrive with shouting or tears. Sometimes they arrive with keys placed down and a door closing for the last time. If you've ever had to make a difficult decision to protect your sense of self, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. You're not alone in this, even when it feels isolating. And if this story stayed with you, if it resonated in a quiet way, I hope you'll stay too. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about reclaiming power, setting boundaries, and choosing yourself when it matters most. Thank you for listening. Sometimes the end of one chapter is exactly what we need to finally start living the next.